right, can you hear me okay? All right, good deal. All right, so you know that I'm a lawyer, and I'm here to talk to you about something that I call crafting the code narrative. And I'm hoping to get you to look at the way that you write code, the way you deal with infrastructure, in a slightly different way. That's kind of the point of a lot of Ignite talks. So, before I was a developer, I was a lawyer. I did a lot of public defense, I did criminal work mostly, and I had to learn how to craft a narrative to tell to a judge or a jury based upon evidence that I would get. I had to make sure it was relevant. So what is a narrative anyway, right? Let's see those words, connected events. It sounds a lot like what we do as developers, right? We connect series of events, right? Everything follows some hopefully logical order. So start thinking about that, thinking about in terms of a narrative. So as a lawyer, for example, I did a lot of DWI prosecutions. Hope you all haven't had too much to drink or aren't driving. I'd get like a list of evidence, and it might contain these kinds of things. And I would look through them, and my job was to pick out what was relevant. So I would think about things really hard, like Saul here, and try to figure out what's relevant, what should I put into my narrative to present before a judge or a jury, because I only want to tell them like a really tight story that makes sense, that people will be engaged in. So let's look at relevance, right? This is the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure for relevant evidence. Let's look at the last one, that's the most important one, of consequence in determining the action. What does that make you think of? Scope creep, right? We want to avoid scope creep. We want to only keep in things that matter. So let's suppose I have a defendant who tells the police, I went for a walk with my dog 6 hours before I had 30 beers and got in my car, right? The walking of the dog is probably not relevant. So that's not something I'd want to put in my narrative. So you're probably wondering, Sonia, what does all of this have to do with coding, right? Like, you told me that this was crafting the code narrative, right? And I am going to tell you how you can now think about your code differently in terms of writing a narrative. So, what are one of the first kinds of stories that we see? User stories, right? You want your user story to have a very clearly defined spec, right? Otherwise, you end up with some mushy cupcakes, right? It needs to be clear. It needs to have relevant information. What about just looking at sort of input and output as a general rule, right? If you start with bad data, you never know what you're going to end up with, right? Think about the way that your data transforms through the process of your code. That's a narrative. It's a story with a beginning and hopefully an end. Then just think about the internet in general. Think about the request-response cycle, right? There's a beginning and an end of that, right? There is a narrative. You are developing an API, right? You've made an API that someone can use, right? That's a story. Testing is another thing, right? Testing is a way that we can document our code. It's a way that we can tell a story about how our code works, right? Hopefully you wrote good tests so that I can look at it and be like, that's, you know, what's happening, and I don't have to go look elsewhere. So testing is a really good way. So what are you, I guess, ultimately, right? As a developer, you're not just a developer, you are a sleuth, right? Especially if you're in a brownfield code base. You need to look for pieces of evidence in your code base so that you can construct a larger narrative. So you're going to be a bit like the Pink Panther. So what might be some of the pieces of evidence that you have in a brownfield code base? You're going to go look at your routes, right? You're going to see your schema, like, what does my data model even look like? I have no idea where I am in this code base. These are all things that you can look at to orient yourself, to select your evidence. For DevOps, right? Think about your architecture infrastructure. Microservices are characters interacting in a story. You need to know the flow of that data. You need to understand how that narrative works. Terraform, Docker, any of that tooling changes what your narrative's going to look like. And then just think even, you know, for greenfield work, the code itself, right? Inheritance is like the backstory, right? You've got conditionals, which are choose your own adventure. So I want you to think about your code when you're writing even greenfield like a narrative, because you're building a story. So who's going to consume your story? You've got code review, right? You've got judges. These are judges that are going to judge what you've written, and hopefully it's really good. It's very clear. You've made sense, just like Judge Jane Bolin, right? Imagine if you're presenting in front of her, right? But who else is going to consume your story, right? Your end user. You want to make sure that they can digest it properly, right? It needs to have good UX. It needs to be scalable so that it's actually usable and doesn't freeze horribly, right? These are all parts of building a cohesive narrative. So what I wanted you to think about is perspective. That's the whole point of this, is to make you look at the way you write your code in a slightly different perspective. You can be a bit of a detective. You can be a bit of an investigator. But you're putting together a case, right, at the very end of it. So yeah, thanks for listening to me. I am going to be also at JSConf US in California in August and DevOps Days Chicago. So you can find me there as well.